Hello and welcome. The day has gone, but the night has only begun. It's time to quiet the mind and soothe the soul. Let these peaceful images and the promise of renewal carry you into a deep and restful sleep. Breathe in and out. Let's begin. Section 1. The Restless Heart and the Unthinkable Request. The sun beat down upon the prosperous estate, warming the pale stone of the manor house and painting the surrounding fields in hues of gold and green. The air was thick with the productive hum of life, the distant bleating of a vast flock of sheep, the lowing of fattened cattle in their pens, the rhythmic sounds of servants tending to the vineyards and olive groves. This was the house of a man known widely for his wisdom, his fairness, and his abundant wealth, a wealth built not on exploitation but on generations of faithful stewardship and blessed labor. He had two sons. The elder, whose name was Jared, was the very image of responsibility. He was a young man of serious countenance and solid build, his hands already calloused from years of working alongside the hired men. He knew every vine, every lamb, every measure of grain in the storehouses. His life was one of dutiful rhythm, his satisfaction found in the orderly progression of the seasons and the increasing prosperity of the land that would one day be his. And then there was the younger son, Levi. Where Jared was solid earth, Levi was flickering fire. He possessed a restless energy that the confines of the estate could not contain. He found the daily routine stifling, his brother's diligence dull, and his father's quiet authority a cage for his soaring, impatient spirit. He would watch the road that passed their land, a dusty ribbon leading to the horizon, his heart aching for the world that lay beyond it. He dreamed of vibrant cities, of exotic sights and sounds, of a life unburdened by duty and expectation. The predictable, blessed life of his father felt like a death sentence. This simmering discontent finally boiled over one evening. The family had shared a meal, the elder son discussing the need to repair a section of the sheepfold, the father nodding in quiet approval. Levi had remained silent, pushing his food around his plate, the words forming in his mind, terrible and irrevocable. After the meal, as the servants cleared the plates, Levi stood. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and audacious resolve. He walked to where his father sat, the patriarch's face illuminated by the soft glow of an oil lamp. "Father," Levi began, his voice tighter and higher than he intended. He swallowed, forcing a steadiness he did not feel. "I cannot wait for death to give me my freedom. Give me now the share of the property that will belong to me." The words hung in the air, sucking the warmth from the room. In their culture, this request was unprecedented. It was a profound act of disrespect, tantamount to saying, "I wish you were already dead. Your life and your timeline are an inconvenience to me. I value your wealth more than I value you." It was a rejection of his father's authority, his love, and his very presence. The elder son, Jared, who had been rolling a scroll, froze, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fury. The few servants in the room averted their gaze, their postures stiff with shock. All eyes turned to the father. They expected a roar of anger, a swift and righteous rebuke, but it did not come. The old man looked at his youngest son, and in his eyes was not anger, but a deep, immeasurable sorrow. He saw not just the insolent demand, but the restless, hungry soul behind it. He knew that keeping him here by force would only breed greater resentment. Sometimes, love must grant the freedom to make catastrophic mistakes. Without a word of reproach, the father slowly nodded. He rose and, with a heavy heart, began the complex and painful process of liquidating a significant portion of his lifelong work. He converted assets, flocks, fields, stored goods, into a vast sum of cash, a fortune that represented years of toil and blessing. A few days later, he placed it all into the hands of his younger son. The weight of the money bags was a physical manifestation of the weight of the opportunity and the cost. Section 2. The Far Country and the Great Famine. The moment the money was in his possession, a transformative energy seized Levi. The restlessness that had plagued him for years crystallized into a single, focused purpose: departure. He wasted no time on sentimental farewells. His father's quiet grief was a burden he refused to carry, and his brother's stony silence was a judgment he was eager to escape. Within days, he had packed his belongings, only the finest of his clothes and a few personal treasures. The morning of his leaving dawned bright and clear, a day full of promise. He did not look back at the manor house, at the fields, or at the figure of his father standing motionless in the courtyard, watching him go. He set his face toward the road, his heart a wild, exultant drum. The money in his travel sacks was his ticket to a new life, a life of his own making. He traveled to a distant, cosmopolitan province, a land known for its loose morals and relentless pursuit of pleasure. The city he entered was a sensory assault after the quiet rhythms of his father's estate. The air, once scented with earth and thyme, was now thick with strange spices, sweat, and the smoky aroma of street food. The sounds of bleating sheep were replaced by the cacophony of hawkers, musicians, and the clatter of chariot wheels on cobblestones. Here, he was no longer the younger son. He was a wealthy, exotic foreigner, and he was determined to live like it. He rented a lavish villa and surrounded himself with a new circle of friends, a shifting, glittering crowd of sycophants and fellow pleasure-seekers who were drawn to the seemingly endless stream of gold from his purse. He funded wild parties that lasted for days, his name becoming synonymous with reckless generosity and decadent living. He bought the finest clothes, the most expensive wines, the affections of the most sought-after companions. For a time, it was everything he had dreamed of. He was the center of his own universe, free from rules, from duty, from the past. But the distant country has a way of consuming those who come to consume it. The fortune that had seemed bottomless began to dwindle. The friends who had been so constant during the days of plenty grew scarce as the money ran out. The parties ended. The villa was reclaimed by its owner. Levi found himself moving from fine inns to squalid rooms. His fine clothes sold off one by one to pay for meager meals. He was learning the brutal mathematics of dissipation. A life of pleasure has a very high and very finite price. Just as the last of his money was spent, a severe famine struck the entire region. It was an act of God, a cosmic convergence of his personal disaster with a public catastrophe. The economy, once booming, collapsed. Food became priceless. The streets that had been filled with music were now filled with the gaunt faces of the desperate. Levi's hunger, once a novelty to be sated with delicacies, became a sharp, constant pain. He was utterly destitute, a foreigner with no resources, no friends, and no family to turn to. The freedom he had so desperately sought had delivered him into the most absolute form of slavery, the slavery of need. The glittering dream had curdled into a waking nightmare. He was alone, hungry, and finally, terrifyingly, aware of the chasm he had leaped into. The music had stopped, the crowd had vanished, and he was left standing in the crushing silence of his own catastrophic choices. The world he had built for himself had no foundation, and it had collapsed entirely, leaving him buried in the rubble of his former life. Section 3. The descent into desperation and the decision to return. Hunger is a ruthless teacher. It strips away pride, illusion, and the last vestiges of self-deception. For Levi, the pangs in his stomach became the catalyst for a clarity he had never possessed in his father's house. He was no longer a young nobleman seeking adventure. He was a starving man fighting for survival. Desperation drove him to seek work, any work, but in a famine, employment was a rare commodity. The bustling markets where he had once spent his gold so freely were now places of tense barter and hollow-eyed despair. After days of futile searching, he finally found a local citizen who had a semblance of stability, a man who owned a small, struggling pig farm on the outskirts of the city. The man, hardened by the times and seeing a desperate foreigner, took pity on him, or perhaps simply saw a source of cheap labor. "I need a hired hand," the man grunted. "The work is with the swine. You feed them, you clean their pens. You'll get a roof over your head and a share of the food." To Levi, this was a crushing blow. For a young man raised in a Jewish household, Pigs were the ultimate symbol of uncleanness. They were forbidden, despised animals. To be in close contact with them was a spiritual and social defilement. Yet, the gnawing in his belly was a more immediate authority than the laws of his upbringing. He swallowed his revulsion and his shattered pride and took the job. His descent was now complete. The son who had once lorded over vast flocks of pure sheep was now a hired servant, a swineherd, in a foreign land. His days were a miserable routine of hauling slop, wading through filth, and breathing the foul, pungent air of the pigsty. The animals he tended were better fed than he was. His share of the food was scant and poor quality, barely enough to keep the hunger at a constant, dull roar. He would watch the pigs devour the carob pods they were fed, and a shocking, humiliating thought began to form in his mind. He was envious of the swine. He longed to fill his own stomach with the pods the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything. This was the rock-bottom moment. Sitting in the muck, the stench of the pigs clinging to his ragged clothes, the reality of his situation crashed upon him with the force of a physical blow. The glamour of his former life was exposed as a hollow lie. The friends had been illusions. His rebellion had not led to freedom, but to the most abject servitude. And in this moment of utter brokenness, a memory surfaced, vivid and painful. How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? He thought. But I am here, dying of hunger. The image of his father's estate arose in his mind, not as a prison, but as a place of abundance and peace. He remembered the hired hands, the men he had once looked down upon. They had full stomachs, a warm place to sleep, and the dignity of honest work for a master who was kind. He, the son, was lower than the lowliest servant in his father's house. This realization was the beginning of his repentance. It wasn't just about being sorry for the money he'd wasted. It was a fundamental reevaluation of his father and his home. His father was not a jailer, but a provider. His home was not a cage, but a refuge. His mind, sharpened by hunger and despair, formulated a plan. It was a plan born of humility, a complete relinquishment of his former claims. I will get up and go to my father, he said to himself, the words a vow. But he did not plan to return as a son. He had forfeited that right. His speech was carefully rehearsed, each word a stone laid upon the grave of his pride. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. He would not ask for restoration, only for employment. He would exchange the servitude of a stranger for the servitude of a known worker. It was the best, the only hope he had. The decision made, a strange new energy filled him. It was not the frantic energy of his departure, but a determined, sober resolve. He stood up, leaving the pigs and the pods behind. He began the long, weary walk home, a journey not just of physical distance, but of the soul. He was going back not as the prodigal son, but as a penitent, hoping only for a corner in the servants' quarters and a crust of bread from the table he had once so carelessly abandoned. Section 4. The long road home and the father's vigil. The journey back was a pilgrimage of humiliation, a stark contrast to his triumphant departure. Where once he had ridden a fine donkey, his bags heavy with gold, he now walked, his feet bare and bloodied, his body weakened by hunger and clothed in the tattered, stinking remnants of his former finery. Each step was a painful reminder of the distance he had placed between himself and home. The landscape, which had once seemed so full of promise, now felt like a vast, accusing emptiness. He avoided the main roads, skulking along the edges of fields and sleeping in ditches, scavenging for whatever scraps he could find. The memory of the carob pods was a constant companion, a benchmark of his degradation that haunted his every waking moment. The rehearsed speech echoed in his mind, a desperate mantra. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. He clung to these words as his only hope, the sole key that might unlock a future slightly less terrible than his present. He imagined the scene 1,000 times. The cold stare of his brother, Jared, the averted eyes of the servants, the quiet, profound disappointment in his father's face. He was prepared for rejection. He expected it. He believed he deserved it. To be turned away at the gate would be a fitting end to his story. Meanwhile, in the estate he had left behind, life had continued, but it was a life marked by a silent, persistent ache. The father had aged in the months since Levi's departure. The lines on his face seemed deeper, and though he went about his duties with the same steady wisdom, a shadow lingered in his eyes. He never spoke of his younger son, but his absence was a presence in every room. Every evening, as the sun began its descent, the father would conclude his daily responsibilities and walk to the highest point on his land, a ridge that offered a commanding view of the road that wound its way from the distant horizon. He would stand there, his hand shielding his eyes from the setting sun, and he would watch. It became a ritual, a silent vigil of hope. The servants knew better than to disturb him during this time. Jared would often see him from a distance, a solitary, unmoving figure against the sky, and a fresh wave of bitterness would wash over him. He saw his father's vigil not as love, but as a weakness, a foolish indulgence for a son who had spat in the face of everything they held dear. "He is wasting his time," Jared would mutter to himself, turning back to the accounts or the repairs that never seemed to end. "The fool is probably dead in a ditch, and he stands there waiting for a ghost." But the father waited nonetheless. His love was not conditional upon his son's worthiness. It was a stubborn, patient, and hopeful force that refused to be extinguished by logic or by pain. He was not waiting for a successful son to return in glory. He was waiting for his son, period. One evening, as the sky was painted in the fiery hues of twilight, the father's heart leaped within his chest. His eyes, still sharp despite his years, caught a movement on the far edge of the road. It was a lone, stumbling figure, a speck of misery shuffling toward the estate. The gait was broken, the posture one of utter defeat. There was no donkey, no baggage, no retinue. It was the walk of a man who had lost everything. But the father knew. He did not need to see the face clearly. A parent's heart recognizes its child long before the eyes can confirm it. It was Levi. He was alive, and he was coming home. The long vigil was over. The waiting was finished. A surge of compassion, raw and powerful, eclipsed all other emotions. The hurt, the disappointment, the months of worry. This was not a moment for dignified reserve or patriarchal judgment. This was a moment for unbridled, scandalous grace. Section 5. The Scandal of Grace and the Robe of Honor. Without a moment's hesitation, the old man did something utterly undignified for a man of his age and station. He gathered up the hem of his robes in his hands, and he ran. He ran down the dusty path from the ridge, his legs pumping, his heart pounding with a wild, joyful urgency. Servants in the fields stopped their work, their mouths agape. They had never seen the master run. It was a sight both shocking and profoundly moving. The father's love could not be contained by protocol or pride. It had to be enacted, physically and immediately. He covered the distance between them in a frantic, breathless sprint, his eyes fixed on the broken figure of his son. Levi, trudging with his head down, rehearsing his speech for the 100th time, was startled by the sound of running feet. He looked up, and the sight that met his eyes was one he could never have imagined in his wildest hopes. It was his father. His father was running towards him. A wave of terror and shame washed over him. He braced himself for the rebuke, for the well-deserved wrath. He opened his mouth to begin his prepared confession, but before a single word could escape his lips, his father reached him. Instead of a slap or a curse, the father threw his arms around his son's neck. The stench of the pigsty, the grime of the road, the ragged clothes, none of it mattered. He embraced him, holding the trembling, emaciated frame tightly, and he kissed him again and again. The kisses were not perfunctory. They were lavish, desperate, joyful. They were a physical language that said, "You are mine. You are home. You are loved." Levi stood frozen, overwhelmed by a grace so potent it felt like a physical force. The rehearsed speech spilled out, broken and choked with sobs. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." He couldn't even bring himself to finish, to ask for the position of a servant. The father's actions had already rendered that request null and void. He was being welcomed not as a hired hand, but as a son. The father, ignoring the confession of unworthiness, turned to the servants who had followed at a distance, their faces a mixture of shock and wonder. His voice, strong and clear, rang out with a series of commands that were nothing short of revolutionary. "Quickly," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for delay. "Bring out the best robe, the first robe, the one reserved for honored guests and celebrations, and put it on him." This was no ordinary garment. It was a symbol of honor, dignity, and full acceptance. To be clothed in the Father's best robe was to have one's shame and filth completely covered, to be reinstated to a position of honor. Put a ring on his hand, the signet ring. This was not merely jewelry. It was the symbol of authority. It gave the bearer the power to transact business in the Father's name. It was a restoration of trust and sonship that was utterly breathtaking in its generosity. And sandals on his feet. Slaves went barefoot. Sons wore sandals. Every command was a deliberate, powerful affirmation. "You are not a servant. You are my son." The servants scrambled to obey, their shock giving way to a joyful frenzy of activity. They led the stunned young man away, stripping him of his rags, washing the grime from his body, and clothing him in the magnificent robe. They slipped the heavy, cold ring onto his finger and fastened sturdy sandals to his clean feet. The transformation was both external and internal. With each act, the identity of the swineherd was being erased, and the identity of the beloved son was being restored. He was being reclothed in his father's love. The father watched, his heart swelling, the months of grief and worry melting away in the heat of this overwhelming joy. His son was not just alive. He was home, and that was all that mattered. The celebration was not just appropriate. It was necessary. The dead had come back to life. The lost had been found. Section 6. The Feast of Joy and the Resentment of Duty. The command that followed was the most extravagant of all. The father, his face alight with a joy the servants had not seen in years, declared to his entire household, "Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." The fattened calf was not everyday food. It was a special reserve, carefully raised and fed for a momentous occasion. A wedding, a major religious festival, the visit of a dignitary. To slaughter it now for this returning, disgraced son was to declare that his homecoming was the most significant event the household could celebrate. It was to value the restoration of one lost soul above all other markers of success and honor. The estate, which had been shrouded in a quiet sorrow for so long, suddenly erupted into a whirlwind of joyous activity. The air, once still, was now filled with the sounds of music and laughter. The smell of roasting meat replaced the familiar sense of dust and livestock. Servants hurried to and fro, setting up tables, pouring wine, and preparing a feast worthy of the master's command. The news spread like wildfire through the compound. The young master was home, and the father's heart was so full that the entire household was invited to share in his joy. It was a unilateral, all-encompassing celebration. There was no period of probation, no stern lecture, no assigning of penance. The father's grace was immediate, total, and scandalously generous. He was not merely tolerating his son's return. He was throwing a party for it. He was actively creating a new reality, a reality defined not by the son's past failure, but by the father's present joy. Meanwhile, the elder son, Jared, was returning from a long day in the fields. He had been supervising the difficult work of digging a new irrigation channel, his body aching, his mind occupied with the endless list of tasks that awaited him. As he approached the house, the sounds of music and celebration reached his ears. It was not a familiar sound. He stopped a young servant who was running past with a jug of wine. "What is going on?" Jared asked, his brow furrowed in confusion and the first stirrings of suspicion. The servant, beaming, replied, "Your brother has come home, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound." The words struck Jared not as good news, but as a profound personal insult. The joy of the household felt like a betrayal. The music was a mockery of his years of dutiful labor. The image of the fattened calf, the symbol of all his future inheritance being lavished on his wastrel brother, ignited a cold, furious rage within him. He refused to go in. All the bitterness he had stored up for months, all the resentment he felt toward his father's seemingly foolish love and his brother's reckless freedom, boiled over. He stood outside in the growing darkness, a solitary monument to duty and disappointment, physically present at the celebration but emotionally a world away. He would not participate in this charade. He would not validate his father's folly with his presence. His anger was a wall he built around his heart, and he stood guard before it, alone. Section 7. The father's second plea and the elder son's accusation. The celebration within the great hall of the manor house was a symphony of restored joy. The long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meat, fresh bread, and flagons of dark wine. The air vibrated with the lively strains of flutes and lyres, and the floor thrummed with the rhythmic stamp of dancing feet. Laughter and cheerful conversation swirled around the central figure of Levi, who sat beside his father, his face still etched with the shock of his welcome but gradually softening into a tentative, disbelieving smile. He was clean, clothed in honor, and surrounded by an abundance that mocked the memory of the carob pods. In the midst of this feast, the father's keen eyes, which had so diligently scanned the horizon for his younger son, now scanned the crowded room for his elder. He noticed Jared's absence immediately. A pang of sorrow, distinct and separate from the overwhelming joy, touched his heart. The family circle was not yet complete. The celebration, for all its fervor, had a missing piece. Without a word of explanation to his guests, the patriarch rose from his place of honor. The music and chatter did not die down, but a path cleared for him as he moved through the throng of revelers, his face set with a new purpose. He found his eldest son exactly as the servant had described. Outside, standing in the cool night air, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his posture rigid with fury. He was a statue of resentment, silhouetted against the warm, lit windows of the house he refused to enter. The father, who had run to meet the prodigal, now went out to plead with the faithful one. This was a different kind of pursuit, no less loving, but requiring a different strategy. He did not command or rebuke. He approached Jared not as a master to a servant, but as a father to a son, his voice gentle, laden with concern. "My son," he began, the term of endearment a stark contrast to the cold anger on Jared's face. He did not say, "Why are you disobeying me?" or "You are ruining the celebration." Instead, he met him where he was in his anger and invited him in. "Please," he entreated, "come in and join us. This is a day for the family to be together." But Jared's heart was a fortress, and his father's gentle words were perceived as a siege. The dam of his resentment broke, and a torrent of long-suppressed grievances poured forth. His voice, when he spoke, was low and shaking with a bitterness that had been fermenting for years. "All these years I have been working like a slave for you," he exploded, his words a deliberate and painful choice. He did not say "with you" or "for the family." He said "for you," framing their relationship as one of master and slave, not father and son. "I have never disobeyed a single command of yours." His righteousness was his banner, his obedience his weapon. He listed his virtues not as a joy, but as a debt he was now calling due. And then he came to the core of his complaint, the perceived injustice that poisoned his entire view of his father's character. "Yet you have never given me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends." He contrasted the meager young goat he felt he was denied with the extravagant fattened calf now being devoured inside. But the most cutting part of his accusation was yet to come. He could not even bring himself to say, "My brother." He pointed a trembling finger towards the house, his voice dripping with contempt. "But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." He disowned his brother, relegating him to "this son of yours." He reduced Levi's complex journey of failure and despair to a sordid, simplistic narrative of hedonism, emphasizing the squandering of your property. In Jared's eyes, this was not a story of a lost soul found. It was a story of a foolish father rewarding a wicked son, thereby devaluing a lifetime of faithful service. He stood there, righteous, angry, and utterly blind to the fact that in his heart, he had been just as far from his father as his brother had been in body. He was lost in the far country of his own resentment. Section 8. The father's tender rebuke and the unspoken invitation. The father did not react to Jared's outburst with matching anger or a lecture on comparative suffering. He heard the deep wound beneath the bitter words, the wound of a son who had been living a joyless, transactional existence right under his own roof. He saw the prison Jared had built for himself, a prison with bars of duty and a lock of perceived injustice. His response was not a defense of his actions toward Levi, but a gentle, profound reminder of Jared's own inestimable value and the true nature of their relationship. "My son," he said again, reaffirming the bond that Jared's anger had sought to sever. He used the same term of endearment for both brothers, refusing to acknowledge the division Jared was trying to create. Then he spoke words meant to shatter the foundational lie of Jared's worldview. "You are always with me." This was the first and greatest gift, one that Levi had foolishly thrown away and that Jared had tragically taken for granted. While Levi was in a distant land, starving for bread, Jared had been in his father's presence every single day. Yet he had been starving for recognition, for what he felt was his due. The father highlighted the immense privilege Jared had possessed all along: constant, uninterrupted communion. He then added, "And everything I have is yours." This was a staggering statement. It was a formal, verbal confirmation of what Jared knew legally but had never grasped relationally. The father was not withholding anything. The entire estate, the flocks, the fields, the storehouses, it all already belonged to Jared in practice and would be his entirely in time. The fattened calf was not being taken from Jared's future inheritance. It was from the portion that was, in the father's eyes, already Jared's to share. The father was revealing the tragic irony of the situation. The elder son, who possessed everything, was acting like a pauper, jealous over a single meal, while the younger son, who had possessed nothing, was overwhelmed by the gift of a single robe. The father reframed the entire event, not as a reward for wickedness, but as a necessary, spontaneous eruption of joy for a miracle. "But we had to celebrate and be glad," he explained. The word "had to" implied a compulsion born of love, not a calculated decision of justice. It was as natural and necessary as breathing. He then gave the reason that transcended all of Jared's accounting of merits and demerits. "Because this brother of yours," here, the father directly countered Jared's disowning phrase. He reestablished the fraternal bond that Jared had broken. "Was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." This was the core of the matter. The father was not celebrating Levi's sin. He was celebrating his return from the grave. He was celebrating the victory of life over death, of found over lost. The feast was a funeral party in reverse, a celebration that a corpse had walked back into the house. The father's words hung in the night air, a tender rebuke and a final, loving invitation. He had corrected Jared's perspective, affirmed his love and value, and explained the heart of the celebration. He did not force him to come in. He left the choice with his elder son. The door was open. The music and laughter from the house continued, a stark contrast to the tense silence between father and son in the courtyard. The parable ends here, with the father's plea lingering and Jared's decision unknown. The story's unresolved ending is its final, powerful challenge. It forces the listener to ask, did Jared, clinging to his bitterness, remain outside in the darkness, a son who was lost while never having left home? Or did he, humbled by his father's patient love, finally step across the threshold, not just into a party, but into a new understanding of grace, allowing his heart to be found alongside his brothers? Section 9. The morning after and the unspoken tensions. The rising sun the next morning seemed to wash the estate in a new, uncertain light. The vibrant sounds of celebration had faded, replaced by the familiar, subdued hum of daily life, the lowing of cattle being led to pasture, the distant chatter of servants beginning their chores. The physical evidence of the feast remained. Trampled grass in the courtyard, the lingering, greasy scent of roasted meat from the dying fire pits, and the palpable emotional hangover that clung to the household. Inside the great house, Levi awoke in his old bed. For a moment, in the haze between sleep and consciousness, he might have believed the previous day was a desperate, hunger-induced dream. But then he felt the unfamiliar weight of the signet ring on his finger, and his hand brushed against the impossibly soft fabric of the fine robe that had been laid over a chair. It was real, the memory of his father's embrace, the crushing weight of unmerited grace, washed over him anew, bringing with it a profound sense of peace so deep it felt like a physical healing. Yet, intertwined with the peace was a sharp, persistent thread of anxiety. He had seen Jared's face in the crowd last night, just a fleeting glimpse of stony disapproval before his brother had vanished. He knew Jared. He knew the rigid, unyielding architecture of his brother's mind. The celebration, for all its joy, had not mended that breach. It had likely widened it. As Levi ventured out of his room, the servants he encountered offered him respectful nods, but their eyes held a new, complex mixture of warmth, curiosity, and perhaps a hint of the same judgment he feared from his brother. He was home, but he was a new and unfamiliar fixture in an old landscape. The father, meanwhile, moved through his morning routine with a serene countenance that belied the undercurrents of tension. His joy was undimmed, a deep, settled fact in his soul. His son was home, yet his wise eyes missed nothing. He saw the way Levi hesitated in doorways, the way he flinched slightly at loud noises, the lingering shadow of shame and unworthiness that the robe and the ring had not yet fully erased. He also saw Jared, who had eventually come inside the night before but had remained a silent, brooding presence on the periphery of the feast. This morning, Jared was already at work, his movements brusque and efficient, his conversation with the foreman clipped and entirely focused on the day's labor. He did not look at Levi. He did not acknowledge his father's peaceful greeting with more than a grunt. The chasm between the brothers was now a physical reality in the courtyard, as tangible as the well they both drew water from but would not share. The father understood that the miracle of return was only the first chapter. The harder work of reconciliation, of weaving two broken narratives back into a single family tapestry, now lay before them. His love had been swift and unconditional for the returning son. Now it would need to be patient and discerning for the son who had never left. The challenge was no longer about rescuing one son from a physical pigsty, but about rescuing the other from the spiritual pigsty of his own resentment. The feast had ended, but the father's work was far from over. Section 10. The weight of the ring and the geography of shame. The days that followed were a strange and disorienting limbo for Levi. The initial, shocking wave of his father's grace had receded, leaving behind the gritty reality of daily life within the estate he had once fled. The magnificent robe felt less like a garment and more like a costume he was unworthy of wearing. The signet ring on his finger was a cold, heavy circlet of trust he was terrified of betraying. Every time he looked at it, he didn't see authority. He saw the ghost of the gold he had squandered, a constant reminder of his fundamental incompetence. He moved through the familiar spaces of his childhood home like a ghost, hyper-aware of the silent judgments he imagined emanating from every servant and every corner. He tried to make himself useful, but his attempts were clumsy and fraught with anxiety. Offering to help a servant carry a sack of grain, he fumbled, spilling a precious portion onto the dirt. The servant had been kind, reassuring him it was nothing, but Levi saw the fleeting look of frustration in the man's eyes before it was masked by deference. That single look confirmed his deepest fear. He was an outsider, a disruption, a charity case tolerated only because of his father's inexplicable favor. He began to avoid the main courtyards and the busy thoroughfares of the estate. He found himself drawn to the edges, to the quiet, forgotten places where he wouldn't be in anyone's way. He spent hours near the sheep pens, not as the master's son, but as a spectator, watching the skilled shepherds work with an efficiency he had never possessed. The simple, purposeful rhythm of their labor was a world away from the chaotic hedonism of the distant country and the stifling inertia of his current shame. He was caught between two identities, belonging to neither. He was no longer the reckless prodigal, but he could not yet step into the role of the restored son. The father, with his profound and patient perception, saw all of this. He saw Levi's skittishness, his self-imposed isolation, the way he shrunk from the weight of the honor he had been given. He understood that grace, once received, must be learned and lived into. It was a new language, and Levi was still fumbling with the most basic syllables. The father did not force him. He did not summon him for a stern talk about stepping up or embracing his responsibilities. Instead, he began a quieter, more subtle ministry of presence. He would find Levi in one of his hiding spots, sitting beside him not as a patriarch, but as a companion. He didn't speak of the past or the future. He spoke of the land. "See how the olive trees on the southern slope are budding earlier this year," he would say, his voice calm and conversational. "The soil there retains the winter moisture better. Your grandfather planted that grove." He was reintroducing Levi to his heritage not as an obligation, but as a story, a living entity he was still a part of. He was slowly, gently, remapping the geography of Levi's shame, transforming the places of hiding back into places of belonging, one quiet observation at a time. Section 11, The Arithmetic of Resentment and the Barren Feast. While Levi wandered the estate's periphery, haunted by a grace he couldn't comprehend, Jared was a vortex of concentrated, righteous activity. The feast had become a festering wound in his soul, and he worked with a ferocious intensity, as if he could purge the memory of it through sheer, unrelenting labor. He was the first to rise and the last to retire, his presence a constant, critical force in the fields, the storehouses, and the workshops. Every task was performed with a flawless, cold precision, but his diligence was not born of love for the land or loyalty to his father. It was a performance, a continuous, unspoken argument against the injustice he had endured. In his mind, he was meticulously adding columns to a ledger of his own virtue, a ledger he fully intended to present to his father one day. He tallied the sacks of grain harvested under his watch, the number of lambs that survived the season due to his vigilance, the repairs he had supervised that saved the estate money. Each entry was a silent indictment of his brother's wastefulness and his father's folly. He saw the fattened calf not as a symbol of joy, but as a debit from his own account. The servants, who had initially been swept up in the father's joy, now felt the chill emanating from the elder brother. They learned to give him a wide berth. A joke shared between two workers would die on their lips as Jared approached. A moment of rest in the shade was cut short by his disapproving glare. The estate, under Jared's relentless management, was becoming a place of sterile efficiency, a well-oiled machine that produced abundance but nurtured no life. The father's feast had been a moment of vibrant, chaotic, life-giving grace, but Jared was imposing a new order, one of cold, hard arithmetic where every resource was accounted for and every joy was suspect. He had refused to enter the celebration, and now he seemed determined to prove that his way, the way of duty, discipline, and desert, was the only legitimate one. He created a feast of his own, a barren one, where the only guests were his own resentment and the main course was the cold satisfaction of being right. He watched his father's gentle interactions with Levi from a distance, his jaw tightening. He saw what he interpreted as coddling, a dangerous reinforcement of irresponsible behavior. In his economy, Levi should have been assigned a penance, a period of hard labor as a hired hand to work off his debt, to earn his way back into the family's good graces. The free gift of the robe and the ring was not just unfair. It was, in Jared's mind, a moral hazard that undermined the very fabric of a well-ordered society. He was not merely angry, he was the guardian of a system, and his father had broken the rules. The tragedy was that in his zeal to uphold justice, Jared was committing a slow, spiritual suicide. He was so busy counting what he was owed that he was blind to everything he already possessed. He was the elder son in the parable, still standing outside the house, now having built walls around himself so high that he could no longer see the open door, nor hear the music that had, in truth, never stopped playing for him. Section 12. The olive press and the first crack. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of the estate finally found its flashpoint not in a dramatic confrontation, but at the old stone olive press. It was the height of the harvest, and the air was thick with the rich, peppery scent of crushed olives. The press, a massive, circular stone turned by a patient donkey, was the engine of a significant part of the family's wealth. Levi, in his ongoing, hesitant attempt to find a place for himself, had been lingering near the press, watching the rhythmic, crushing work. The overseer, a man named Hezron, was a veteran of the estate, loyal and capable, but on this day he was struggling. A crucial wooden pin in the press's mechanism had sheared, halting the entire operation. A line of carts laden with olives waited, and the precious oil was not flowing. Hezron, sweating and frustrated, was barking orders at two younger servants who were fumbling with a replacement pin, their efforts ineffective. Jared was there in an instant, his voice a whip crack of impatience. "Fools, you're angling it wrong. You'll splinter the new one. Move aside." He shoved past them, his face a mask of contempt for their incompetence. He grabbed the tools, his movements sharp and angry. In his frustration, he forced the pin, and a sickening crack echoed over the noise of the waiting workers. He had not only failed to fix it, he had made the damage worse, jamming the splintered wood deep into the mechanism. Profound silence fell. The cost of the delay, and now the more extensive repair, was written on every face. It was in this moment of stinging failure, as Jared stood fuming over his own mistake, that a quiet voice spoke from the periphery. "Hezron," Levi said, his voice tentative but clear. All eyes turned to him. He took a hesitant step forward. In the far country, I saw a press like this. The man who owned it, he used a trick with a hot iron to burn out the broken wood. It doesn't damage the stone. Then you can grease the new pin with rendered fat before you tap it in. It slides home smoothly. He spoke not to Jared, but to the overseer, his knowledge offered as a humble suggestion, not a challenge. Hezron looked from the jammed press to Levi's earnest face, and then to the fuming elder brother. A flicker of hope replaced the frustration in his eyes. "My lord," he said, deferring to Jared, but his tone was a question. Jared's face was a thundercloud. To accept advice from his wastrel brother, especially in front of the men, was an unbearable humiliation. It was an affront to his authority and his entire worldview. "We don't do things here the way they do in your brothels and taverns." Jared spat, the words venomous and loud enough for all to hear. The insult hung in the air, cruel and deliberate. Levi flinched as if struck, the color draining from his face. The old shame came rushing back, confirming his deepest fears. But then something unexpected happened. Hezron, the loyal servant, did not look away in awkward silence. He looked at Jared, and for the first time, there was no fear in his eyes, only a weary resolve. "With respect, my lord," Hezron said, his voice steady. "The press is broken. Your way has broken it further. The young master's way. It is worth a try. We are losing oil." It was a rebellion, a small one, but a rebellion nonetheless. The authority Jared had built on a foundation of relentless criticism and cold efficiency was cracking. In that moment, the servants saw not a capable master, but a proud man who would rather let the estate suffer than accept help. They saw Levi, not as a redeemed sinner, but as someone with practical knowledge, however acquired, who was trying to help. Jared, isolated by his own pride, saw the shift in their faces. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stalked away, leaving the broken press and the silent accusation of the workers behind him. Levi, his heart still pounding from the public shaming, looked at Hezron. The overseer gave him a slow, deliberate nod. "Fetch the iron," he said to an apprentice. The first, fragile crack had appeared in the wall between the brothers, not built by the father's pleading, but by the elder brother's pride and the younger brother's hesitant, practical offer of peace. Section 13. The Father's Counsel and the Unraveling of Certainty. The confrontation at the olive press sent ripples through the entire estate, a tremor that could not be ignored. Jared, humiliated and enraged, retreated into a stony silence, his presence a cold shadow that seemed to lower the temperature of any room he entered. He avoided his father entirely, taking his meals alone and communicating with the household only through terse, written notes delivered by a servant. The fracture was now complete and public. Levi, meanwhile, was caught in a storm of conflicting emotions. The sting of Jared's public insult was acute, a fresh layer of shame painted over the old. Yet, it was mingled with a strange new sensation, a flicker of vindication. Hezron had listened to him. The servants, while wary, had not dismissed his idea. For the first time since his return, he had contributed something of practical value. A small piece of knowledge gleaned from the wreckage of his failed life that had actually helped the home he had wronged. It was a confusing, paradoxical feeling. The very experiences that were the source of his deepest regret had yielded a tool for modest usefulness. The father, observing this new dynamic with a heavy but clear-sighted heart, knew the time had come for a more direct intervention. He could not force a reconciliation, but he could create a space where the tangled threads of resentment and shame might begin to loosen. He summoned Jared to his private study, a room lined with scrolls and the quiet aroma of cedar and old parchment. Jared entered with the posture of a man attending his own trial, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond his father's shoulder. The father did not speak of the olive press. He did not mention Levi. Instead, he unrolled a large, weathered map of their lands onto the heavy wooden table. "The boundary dispute with old Nahum," the father began, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "It has festered for too long. His goats are grazing on the upper pasture that is rightfully ours. I need you to ride out there, meet with him and his sons and settle this permanently." It was a task of significant responsibility, one that required diplomacy, firmness, and a deep understanding of their family's history and legal rights. It was a clear affirmation of Jared's position and capabilities. Jared's rigid posture softened by a fraction. This was language he understood: duty, responsibility, the defense of the estate. "It will be done," he said, his voice tight, "but I will need to be gone for 3, perhaps 4 days." The father nodded. "Take whomever you need." As Jared turned to leave, already mentally composing his arguments for the negotiation, the father added, almost as an afterthought, "While you are away, the accounts for the spring shearing need to be finalized. The merchant from Damascus will arrive soon to settle the payment. Levi will see to it." Jared froze, his hand on the door latch. He turned slowly, his face a mask of disbelief. "Levi? The accounts? Father, he couldn't manage his own purse, let alone the proceeds from the entire flock. This is madness. He will be cheated blind, or worse, he will..." He couldn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air. He will squander it again. The father met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "The decision is made, my son." It was not a rebuke, but a statement of fact. Jared stared at him for a long moment, a maelstrom of betrayal and fury in his eyes. Then, without another word, he wrenched the door open and left, the sound of his retreating footsteps echoing like hammer blows in the quiet house. The father stood alone, the map spread before him. He had not given the task to Levi because he believed him to be a master accountant. He had done it to force a crisis, to unravel Jared's certainty, and to offer Levi a thread of trust. It was a dangerous gamble, a deliberate shaking of the foundations. He was forcing both his sons to look into the abyss of their own fears: Jared's fear of chaos and incompetence, and Levi's fear of his own untrustworthiness. It was a painful, necessary step on the path toward either total breakdown or a breakthrough born of desperate need. Section 14. The Ledger and the Looming Shadow. The news of his new responsibility struck Levi with the force of a physical blow. The father's quiet pronouncement, delivered to him in the courtyard, felt less like an assignment and more like a sentence. The accounts for the spring shearing represented a substantial portion of the estate's annual income. It was intricate work, involving complex calculations of the weight and quality of wool, pre-negotiated prices, and the settling of debts with the shearers. It was a task that Jared performed with infallible, if joyless, precision. To Levi, the heavy ledger, filled with his brother's neat, uncompromising script, was a testament to everything he was not: disciplined, reliable, trustworthy. The ghost of his squandered inheritance seemed to rise from the pages, mocking him. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. He wanted to refuse, to run to his father and beg him to reconsider, to confess that he was not ready, that he would surely fail. But the memory of the olive press held him back. Hezron's nod, the small spark of usefulness he had felt. It was a fragile seed, but it was something. And beneath the panic, a deeper, more stubborn emotion stirred. A desire, however faint, to not be the person Jared believed him to be. He took the ledger to a small, sunlit room off the main courtyard, a place usually used for storing parchment and ink. He spread the pages before him, the columns of numbers swimming in his vision. The first day was a torment of self-doubt and clumsy calculations. He made errors, smudged the ink, and had to scrape the parchment clean and start again. He worked late into the night, the oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to morph into the specters of his past failures. He remembered the frantic, desperate calculations in the distant country as his money ran out, the cold dread of realizing the numbers would never add up. This felt eerily similar, but with a crucial difference. This time, the stakes were not his own pleasure, but his father's well-being. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the estate grew tense with Jared's absence. His efficient, if oppressive, order was gone, and a nervous uncertainty took its place. The servants, while sympathetic to Levi's obvious struggle, missed the predictable rhythm Jared imposed. Whispers traveled through the compound. Will the young master get it right? The Damascene merchant is shrewd. He'll smell uncertainty. The master is testing him, but what if he fails? The looming shadow of the merchant's arrival became a collective anxiety. Levi felt the weight of their gazes, their unspoken questions. He ate little and slept less, his face growing gaunt, the dark circles under his eyes a testament to his internal battle. He was not just fighting numbers, he was fighting the person he had been. He was fighting the narrative of the wastrel, the fool, the unworthy son. Every correctly added column, every properly reconciled payment to a shearer, felt like a small victory in a war for his very soul. He was no longer just trying to balance a ledger. He was trying to balance the scales of his own redemption, and the terrifying truth was that the outcome was entirely in his hands. His father had given him the trust, but the proof of its validity had to come from him. Section 15. The Merchant's Arrival and the Test of Truth. The day of the merchant's arrival dawned clear and bright, a cruel contrast to the storm of anxiety raging within Levi. He had spent the entire previous night hunched over the ledger, double-checking and triple-checking his figures until his eyes burned. The final numbers were before him, a summation of the spring shearing that would either vindicate his father's risky trust or confirm his brother's most damning predictions. He had bathed and put on the fine robe, but it felt like a disguise. The ring on his finger was a lead weight. He stood in the main courtyard, the rolled-up ledger clutched in his sweating hands, as the Damascene merchant, a man named Malachi, arrived with a small caravan. Malachi was everything Levi was not. Confident, polished, his eyes missing nothing. He was a man who built his fortune on reading people as well as he read the quality of goods. He greeted Levi with a formal, slightly condescending politeness. "You are the son handling the accounts?" he asked, his tone implying he had expected the elder brother. "I am," Levi replied, his voice tighter than he wished. He led Malachi to a shaded area where a table had been set up. As they sat, Levi unrolled the ledger. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. The negotiation began. Malachi, as expected, was a tough negotiator. He questioned the recorded weights, suggested the quality of the wool was not as high as stated, and proposed a lower price per measure. This was the moment Levi had dreaded. The old Levi, the insecure and desperate Levi, would have crumbled, agreeing to a bad deal just to end the uncomfortable confrontation. But the memory of the pigsty, the taste of carob pods, and the crushing weight of his father's grace rose up within him. He had been to the absolute bottom, and somehow that gave him a strange, solid footing. He looked Malachi directly in the eye. "The weights were verified by 2 witnesses, as is our custom," he stated, his voice gaining a shred of steadiness. "And the quality was graded by Hezron himself, whose judgment in wool is unmatched in this region. The price we agreed upon last season stands. It is fair for both of us." He did not bluster or become angry. He simply held his ground, referring to the estate's customs and the expertise of its servants, not his own authority. Malachi studied him, his shrewd eyes taking in the fine robe, the signet ring, but also the faint tremor in Levi's hands and the shadow of exhaustion on his face. He saw not a profligate wastrel, but a young man fighting a terrible battle with himself. The merchant was a hard man, but he was not without a certain wisdom. He recognized the raw courage it took for someone like Levi to sit across from him and not fold. After a long, silent moment, Malachi's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Very well," he said. "The price stands. Let us review the final tally." Levi, his heart still pounding, walked him through the calculations. To his own astonishment, he found himself explaining the figures clearly, answering questions without hesitation. The long, tortured hours with the ledger had forged a familiarity that now felt like a kind of strength. The transaction was completed. The payment, a substantial sum of silver and trade goods, was handed over and meticulously counted by the estate's treasurer. As Malachi and his caravan prepared to leave, the merchant paused and looked back at Levi. "You are not your brother," he said, a statement of fact, not an insult. "But you have your father's tenacity. Tell him Malachi sends his respects." And with that, he was gone. Levi stood alone in the courtyard, the successful transaction complete. There was no cheering, no celebration, just a profound, trembling silence. He had done it. He had not been cheated. He had not failed. The ledger was balanced. The estate's interests had been protected. A feeling spread through him that was entirely new. A quiet, solid warmth that was entirely different from the fleeting euphoria of his former dissipations. It was the feeling of integrity. He had faced the test and, against every expectation including his own, he had not been found wanting. The robe no longer felt like a costume. The ring no longer felt like a weight. For the first time since his return, he felt, in some small foundational way, that he was home. Section 16. The Return of the Elder and the Unspoken Report. Jared returned to the estate on the evening of the 4th day, dust-covered and weary from the road, but with the grim satisfaction of a task accomplished. The boundary dispute with old Nahum was settled, the markers firmly re-established in the family's favor. He had been uncompromising in his negotiations, leveraging every legal precedent and historical claim, and he had won. He expected to return to a household teetering on the brink of the chaos he had predicted. He envisioned misplaced orders, confused servants, and his brother having inevitably failed in the one responsibility their foolish father had entrusted to him. He rode through the main gate, his posture erect, ready to receive the grim reports and begin the work of restoring order. But the estate he entered was not in chaos. It was calm. The evening chores were proceeding with their usual rhythm. The sheep were penned, the cook fires were smoking, and the servants moved with a purpose that seemed, if anything, more relaxed and less fearful than when he had left. There was no sense of crisis. It was normal. This ordinary peace was more disconcerting to Jared than any outright disaster would have been. He dismounted, handing the reins to a stable boy, and strode toward the main house. His first stop was the small room where the accounts were kept. He pushed the door open, his eyes scanning for evidence of his brother's incompetence. Scattered scrolls, ink stains, incorrect calculations scratched out. The room was tidy. The ledger for the spring shearing sat neatly on the desk. He snatched it up, his eyes, trained for years in the detection of error, scanning the columns. The script was not his own clean, sharp hand. It was Levi's, initially hesitant and then growing more assured. He traced the numbers, the additions, the final settlement. He checked the recorded payment against the expected price. It was all there. It was correct. Not just passable, but meticulously, undeniably correct. The silver and goods had been logged into the storehouse. The Damascene merchant had been dealt with fairly and firmly. A cold, hard knot formed in Jared's stomach. This was not the vindication he had craved. It was a confounding, deeply unsettling anomaly. It contradicted the entire narrative that had structured his world since his brother's return. He sought out Hezron, finding the overseer by the well. "The accounts," Jared said, his voice clipped. "The merchant. Was there any trouble?" Hezron met his gaze, his expression neutral, but his eyes holding a glint of something Jared couldn't quite identify. "Was it respect?" "No trouble, my lord," Hezron replied. "The young master handled it. He was firm with Malachi, stood his ground on the price. The man paid in full." Hezron paused, then added, "It was well done." The words, "well done," spoken about Levi, felt like a physical blow. Jared simply nodded, turning away before his face could betray the turmoil within. He had returned victorious from his own mission, having expanded the family's holdings, and yet he felt as though he had suffered a profound and inexplicable defeat. The foundation of his righteous anger, the certainty of his brother's inherent inadequacy, had developed a hairline crack. The world was no longer the orderly, predictable place where the faithful were rewarded and the profligate failed. A dangerous, chaotic element of grace had intruded, and it terrified him. Section 17. The silent meal and the language of absence. That evening, the family shared a meal for the first time since the feast. The atmosphere in the dining hall was thick with everything that remained unspoken. The father sat at the head of the table, his demeanor peaceful, his eyes quietly observing his two sons. Levi, seated on one side, seemed different. The cowering anxiety that had clung to him like a shroud had lessened. He held himself with a new, tentative stillness. He did not boast of his success with the merchant. He seemed almost unaware of it, as if the true victory had been an internal one, fought and won in the quiet of the accounts room. He ate his food, his gaze occasionally drifting to his brother, not with challenge, but with a watchful, weary curiosity. Jared, on the opposite side, was a study in controlled tension. He reported on his successful mission with Nahum in a few terse sentences, his voice devoid of any triumph. "The boundary is settled. The markers are set. He will not trouble us again." The father nodded, offering a word of praise. "You have done well, my son. The estate is secure because of your diligence." But the praise seemed to bounce off Jared, failing to penetrate the fortress of his resentment. He then fell into a silence so profound it was louder than any argument. He did not look at Levi. He did not ask about the shearing accounts. He did not acknowledge his brother's presence in any way. It was a silence that spoke volumes. It said, "You are nothing to me. Your successes are illusions. Your presence here is a mistake I refuse to validate." He used his absence of words as a weapon, creating a void at the table into which all possibility of conversation collapsed. Levi, who had braced himself for another direct insult, found this silent treatment somehow more painful. An argument he could engage with, this cold, absolute negation was impervious. He felt himself shrinking back into invisibility under the weight of Jared's disregard. The meal proceeded with the clatter of utensils and the oppressive weight of the unsaid. The father did not try to force a conversation. He understood that some chasms cannot be bridged by words alone. He watched the body language of his sons, Jared's rigid, closed-off posture, Levi's slowly returning slouch of dejection. The food, though plentiful and well-prepared, tasted of ashes. The feast of celebration had been loud and life-giving. This meal was a funeral for fraternity. When the last course was cleared, Jared stood without a word and left the hall. Levi lingered for a moment, looking at his father, a question in his eyes that he could not form into words. The father gave him a small, sad smile and a slight nod, a silent communication that said, "I see you. I am here." But it was a poor substitute for the brotherhood that was being so stubbornly withheld. The path to reconciliation, it seemed, would be far longer and more arduous than any of them had imagined, paved not with grand gestures, but with the painful, incremental work of dismantling walls built over a lifetime. Section 18, The Broken Wall and the Reluctant Alliance. The next crisis was not one of finance or diplomacy, but of nature. A sudden, violent spring storm, born over the distant mountains, swept down into the valley with unanticipated fury. It was not the gentle, life-giving rain of the season, but a deluge that turned dry stream beds into raging torrents. The worst of its wrath was focused on the northern perimeter of the estate, where a long, dry stone wall, painstakingly built by Jared and the servants over the previous year, protected a fertile lower field from soil erosion. In the gray, watery light of dawn, a breathless shepherd brought the news. A section of the new wall, undermined by the torrential runoff, had collapsed. A gaping wound now lay open, and with the ground saturated, the entire field and its newly sprouted crop was in imminent danger of being washed away. It was a race against time and the elements. Jared, upon hearing the news, immediately began barking orders, mustering every available hand. The urgency of the physical task was a relief, a clear enemy to fight. But as the servants and field hands gathered, their faces grim, it became apparent that the scale of the damage was greater than the manpower available. They needed more strong backs, and they needed them now. It was in this moment of practical crisis that Levi appeared at the edge of the gathered crowd. He was not summoned. He had heard the commotion and had come to see. He stood, watching Jared's efficient but strained mobilization, his own hands empty. He knew better than to offer advice on stonework. This was Jared's domain, the very embodiment of his diligent, physical legacy. To speak would be to invite another cutting remark. But he also saw the problem. There were not enough people. The job was too big. Jared, his tunic already plastered to his body by the relentless drizzle, finally saw his brother standing there. Their eyes met across the muddy courtyard. A silent, electric communication passed between them. It was not friendship. It was not forgiveness. It was the raw, pragmatic acknowledgement of a shared threat to their father's livelihood. Jared's first instinct was to turn away, to prove he could handle this alone, as he handled everything. But the sight of that crumbling wall, the image of the precious topsoil washing away, overrode his pride. He gave a short, sharp jerk of his head. "Well?" he snapped, his voice cutting through the rain. "Are you just going to stand there? Get over here and help us move stone." It was not an invitation. It was a command, gruff and impersonal. But it was an acknowledgement. Levi didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, joining the line of men. He worked in silence beside the servants, his city-softened hands quickly becoming raw and bloody as he hauled the heavy, wet stones. He did not try to work beside Jared. They operated at opposite ends of the breach, but they were part of the same organism, fighting the same battle. The work was brutal, muddy, and exhausting. There were no words of encouragement, no camaraderie, just grunts of effort, the squelch of mud, and the grating sound of stone on stone. Yet, in that shared, physical labor, something shifted. Levi was not being judged on his past or his worthiness. He was being measured by the weight he could carry and his willingness to carry it. And Jared, for all his silence, could not help but see the dogged persistence in his brother's efforts. He saw him slip in the mud and get back up, saw him strain under a stone too heavy for him but refused to let go. It was a language they both understood, more honest than any words that had passed between them. The wall was repaired by midday, the breach sealed just as the rain began to slacken. The field was saved. As the men trudged back, weary and caked in mud, Jared walked ahead, alone. Levi fell into step at the rear with the servants. No words were exchanged, but the alliance, however reluctant and temporary, had been forged. The wall of stone was rebuilt. The wall between the brothers, while still standing, had, for the first time, been breached from both sides. Section 19. The weary truce and the language of labor. The days following the storm and the frantic repair of the wall settled into a new, fragile rhythm on the estate. The air, once crackling with open hostility and bitter silence, was now merely thick with a weary, watchful truce. The shared, back-breaking labor at the wall had not created friendship, but it had established a precedent of pragmatic cooperation. Jared no longer actively turned his back when Levi entered a room. He simply accepted his presence as one might accept a piece of necessary, if unappealing, furniture. Levi, for his part, stopped flinching at every sound, his constant state of high alert gradually downgrading to a more manageable wariness. He began to find small, consistent ways to make himself useful, not in the grand, terrifying manner of the merchant's accounts, but in the quiet, unglamorous corners of the estate's daily life. He noticed a broken hinge on a storage shed door and, remembering a tinker he had met in the far country, fashioned a crude but effective repair. He helped the old gardener, whose hands were gnarled with arthritis, to weed a particularly stubborn herb garden, working in companionable silence for hours. He was learning the language of the land not through grand pronouncements, but through the quiet vocabulary of calloused hands and observed need. This was a language Jared understood, even if he refused to acknowledge it. He saw the repaired hinge. He saw the weeded garden. He said nothing, but the evidence was there. A silent, accumulating argument against his fixed narrative of Levi's worthlessness. The father watched this slow, organic process with a hope that was both patient and aching. He knew that lectures on forgiveness were useless. True reconciliation could not be dictated from the head of the table. It had to be unearthed, stone by heavy stone, from the common ground of shared responsibility. He began, very subtly, to assign them tasks that, while not requiring direct collaboration, existed in parallel. He sent Jared to assess the health of the newly planted vineyard on the western slope and asked Levi to inventory the stock of wine jars and sealing wax in the storage caves below the house. They were working on different aspects of the same project, their labor intrinsically linked to the future prosperity of the estate, even if they never spoke a word to each other. It was a strategy of proximity, of forcing their separate orbits to gradually, imperceptibly, draw closer. One evening, as the sun set, Jared returned from the vineyard, his notes filled with observations about soil pH and pest damage. Levi emerged from the storage caves, a clay tablet in his hand detailing the number of jars ready for the next harvest. They arrived at the father's study at almost the same moment, each holding a piece of the puzzle. They stood in the doorway, a few feet apart, not looking at each other. The father looked from one to the other, his expression neutral. "The vineyard looks strong," Jared reported, his voice flat, "but we will need to treat for grubs before the moon is full." Levi, without being asked, added, "There are enough jars, but the sealing wax is low. We will need to trade for more before the pressing." It was not a conversation. It was two separate reports delivered into the same space. But for the first time, their individual efforts were not in opposition. They were complementary. The father nodded, accepting both tablets. "Then we will see to both," he said simply. The brothers turned and left, going their separate ways into the twilight. But a thread, finer than silk and stronger than steel, had been spun between them in that doorway. It was the thread of a shared purpose, and though neither would have admitted it, the estate felt more whole for it. Section 20. The sick lamb and the unlikely teacher. The next crack in the wall of resentment came from an unexpected source. A single, ailing lamb. It was the youngest of the spring flock, a runt that had struggled from birth and had been weakened further by the recent storm. It lay apart from the others in the fold, its breathing labored, its eyes dull. The shepherd, a young man named Ethan, was distressed. He had done everything he knew, but the lamb was fading. Jared, making his evening rounds, stopped and examined the animal with a critical eye. His knowledge was vast, but it was the knowledge of systems and herds, of preventing large-scale disease and maximizing yield. The intimate, desperate struggle of a single, insignificant life was outside his usual purview. "It's probably a lung fever from the damp," he diagnosed, his tone clinical. "It likely won't survive the night. Don't waste more resources on it. Focus on the healthy ones." It was a logical, economically sound decision. But as he turned to leave, he saw Levi approaching. Levi had been watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at Jared. He knelt in the straw beside the lamb, his movements gentle. He had seen such suffering in the distant country, not in animals but in people. He had seen the hollow-eyed desperation of the starving, the fevers that racked the bodies of those living in squalor. He had learned, through brutal necessity, a kind of rough, practical empathy for the fragile spark of life. He placed a hand on the lamb's side, feeling its rapid, shallow breaths. "In the city," Levi said, his voice quiet, not directed at anyone in particular, "I saw a physician treat a child with a similar rattling in its chest. He used steam, boiling water with thyme and eucalyptus leaves. The mother held the child over the pot, under a blanket. It loosened the phlegm, helped it breathe." Ethan, the shepherd, looked from Jared's impassive face to Levi's kneeling form, hope warring with deference to the elder brother's authority. Jared stood frozen. This was an affront to his competence. It was superstition, a folk remedy from the corrupt world Levi had inhabited. To entertain it was to admit a gap in his own knowledge. "We are shepherds, not physicians," Jared stated, his voice cold. "We do not have eucalyptus leaves. We have time," Levi replied, still not looking up, his focus entirely on the struggling animal. "And we have a pot, and we have fire. It is a small thing to try for a life." The challenge was unspoken but palpable. Jared could order them to stop, to let nature take its course as he had dictated. But the image of Levi, the wastrel, showing a compassion he himself had dismissed as a waste of resources, was a deep and uncomfortable prick to his conscience. He saw the plea in young Ethan's eyes. With a curt, disgusted wave of his hand, he said, "Do what you want, but do not neglect the rest of the flock for this one." He strode away, but he did not go far. He positioned himself where he could watch, unseen, from the shadow of the sheepfold. He saw Levi and Ethan build a small, careful fire, boil a pot of water, and crumble dried thyme into it. He saw them create a tent with a blanket and gently hold the lamb in the warm, medicated steam. It was a foolish, sentimental scene. And yet, as the minutes passed, he heard the lamb's ragged breathing begin to ease. The frantic rattling in its chest softened. After a time, the lamb struggled weakly, and Levi offered it a drink of water mixed with a little honey, which it took. The spark of life, which Jared had written off, had been fanned back into a fragile flame. Jared turned and walked away into the darkness, his mind in turmoil. His brother, the man who had squandered everything, had just taught him something about the value of a single life. The lesson was not about animal husbandry. It was about a kind of stubborn, illogical care that existed outside the balance sheets of merit and cost. It was a language his father seemed to speak fluently, and one which Levi, from the depths of his degradation, had somehow learned. Jared, the master of the estate, was suddenly the student, and the teacher was the last person on earth he would have ever chosen. Section 21. The Harvest Festival and the Empty Chair. The time for the annual Harvest Festival arrived, a celebration even more deeply rooted in the life of the estate than the feast for the fattened calf. It was a communal event, a thanksgiving for the land's bounty where every servant, every field hand, and their families were guests of honor. The great courtyard was transformed with lanterns and long trestle tables laden with food from the recent harvest. Roasted grains, new wine, olives, figs, and bread baked from the first threshed wheat. There was music and laughter, a genuine, unforced joy that permeated the air. The father moved among his people, his face radiant, his joy infectious. He was in his element, the patriarch who was also a brother to those who worked his land. Levi was there too. He no longer lingered on the edges. He helped carry platters of food. He exchanged a quiet word with Hezron. He even shared a brief smile with Ethan, the shepherd, a silent acknowledgement of the lamb that was now thriving with the flock. He was being woven back into the social fabric of the estate, one tentative thread at a time. He was, if not yet fully embraced, at least accepted. But one chair at the family table remained conspicuously empty, Jared's. As the celebration reached its peak, the father's eyes, which missed little, kept returning to that vacant seat. The joy on his face became tinged with a familiar sorrow. He finally gestured to a servant and spoke a few quiet words. The servant nodded and hurried away. Levi, watching from across the courtyard, felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He knew where the servant was going. Jared was found, as Levi had suspected, not in the fields, but in the accounts room, a single lamp illuminating the ledger he was meticulously updating by the faint, flickering light. The festival sounds were a distant, mocking cacophony to him. The servant cleared his throat. "My lord," he said hesitantly, "your father. He asks that you join the celebration." Jared did not look up. His pen continued its steady scratch across the parchment. "I am working," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The accounts for the harvest must be started. Someone must be mindful of the cost of all this merriment." The servant shifted uncomfortably. "The master insists. He says it is not right for the elder son to be absent from his own table." At this, Jared's head snapped up. His eyes, in the lamplight, were hard and bright with a bitter fire. "His own table?" he repeated, the words dripping with sarcasm. "Tell my father that I am where I belong, ensuring that there will be a table for future festivals. He can enjoy his party." The servant, knowing better than to argue, bowed and retreated. The message was delivered to the father not in Jared's bitter words, but in the simple report of his refusal. The father's shoulders slumped for a moment, the weight of his eldest son's choice pressing down on him. He looked at Levi, who met his gaze with a look of shared understanding and sadness. The feast continued around them, a vibrant, joyful spectacle. But for the father and the younger son, the empty chair at the table was the most powerful presence there. The music played, but for them, a crucial harmony was missing. The prodigal was home and was learning to feast, but the faithful son was now the one in self-imposed exile, choosing the cold, hard numbers of the ledger over the warm, messy, and costly grace of the celebration. The story had turned, and the one who was lost was no longer the one who had left.